Hi everybody, my name is Ian Lawson. I work for Red Hat. What we're going to talk about now is something called the Migration Toolkit for Virtualization. We've talked about OpenShift virtualization and the technology that it uses to actually produce the virtual machines being orchestrated in a next generation container way. But this really doesn't help people who've got a massive legacy estate of virtual machines. So what we've done as part of the product is produce a tool which comes as free, which actually allows you to connect to a legacy virtualization system and import the virtual machines. And the way it works is this. You start with what we call the legacy virtual machine system. Let's take, for example, VMware. You have vCenter, which is your API point that you talk to. And what we have in the MTV is the concept of what we call a provider. And a provider gives you a handle to talk to the API of that system. So you have a VMware provider. How this actually works is it talks into the API of the target system and then gives you a list of your current estate. So for example, if your vCenter estate has 3 hypervisors on it, and let's say you've got 3 VMs on one, 4 on the next one, 7 on that one. What the provider will do is it will provide a list of all the VMs that are currently running. What you can then do using the MTV is produce what's called a plan. So you can choose to lift and shift those VMs as is, right there and then, like a big bang approach, or you can produce a temporal plan. So you can actually defer the moving of the virtual machines themselves. In addition, what it does is it looks at the configuration of the virtual machines, and you can set up what are called storage and network profiles. So what you can do with those configurations is actually inherit and bring the virtual machine across with the direct definitions for the storage and the network that it had before. And the way it actually physically works is it takes the virtual machine image. In the case of, for example, VMware, it'll be a VMDK or an OVA for an appliance. It does what's called a V2V. And what V2V does is it converts the file format of that virtual machine from VMDK into the KVM format that's used by OpenShift. It then moves that VM across into the OpenShift cluster and executes it. By default, when the MTV runs, you have this concept called cold migration. And how that works is every single virtual machine that's moved is actually physically turned off at the original provider. It's V2V'd across into the OpenShift cluster, and it's restarted. However, we've got another mechanism as part of the MTV, which is called warm. And what warm does is uses a technology called change block tracking. It leaves the virtual machine running at the original system. It copies across all the components of that virtual machine that are static, that aren't changing. And when it runs out of these change blocks, when it gets to a position where they are no longer static, at that point it will turn off the virtual machine, perform the V2V on the last couple of blocks, and restart it on the OpenShift cluster. You'll still have a period where you have to shut down and restart, but that period is much smaller if you do a warm migration. So if you want to migrate in a state where there are VMs that are critical or have the ability to not be offline for too long, you can use warm migration. Another interesting feature, and one of the nice things about the MTV, is we now provide a provider endpoint for the ESXi SDK. What that means in English is you can actually target the individual hypervisors. And why this is useful is you can do an installation of OpenShift. If you remember, we talked about the 3 nodes for the control plane and additional worker nodes where the virtual machines execute. So you can install a basic OpenShift that has three control plane machines and a single worker node. You can then run the MTV using the ESXi SDK to only copy the VMs on one hypervisor. In this example here, we would take, for example, these 3. and move them into the worker node. At that point, we can decommission this hypervisor and then recommission the hardware as another worker node. So effectively what happens is your original VM estate or your VMware estate will shrink as your OpenShift estate grows. It means you don't have to purchase 200% of the hardware to do a one-to-one migration from point to point. That's one of the advantages of being able to target the ESXi actual SDK itself. The V2V process is fast. The only limitation you got on the V2V process is the latency of the network itself. So that was a very quick introduction to what we call the Migration Toolkit for virtualization. That actually comes for free as part of the virtualization of OpenShift. When you've got an OpenShift subscription, you get virtualization for free. The last thing I want to talk about very quickly is operating system support. So when you're running, for example, a single worker node, you have an OpenShift subscription for that, which gives you virtualization for free. Within that worker node itself, you can run as many supported instances of RHEL without having to have a subscription. So if you're already, for example, running a hypervisor on VMware where you're running 20 instances of RHEL, you will have had to have had 20 subscriptions for those RHEL boxes. If you move those virtual machines into a worker node on OpenShift, you no longer need the subscription costs for those RHEL boxes. And the second thing is Microsoft Windows. Microsoft have this fantastic process called the SVVP. And what it does is it gives you a certified level of support of an operating system provided by Microsoft running on a specific hypervisor. OpenShift has, for the last 2 years, had SVVP from Microsoft. And what that means in English is you can run your Microsoft virtual machines with 100% support from Microsoft themselves. They currently support Server 2016, 2019, and 2022, and Windows 10 and 11. So if you've got an existing legacy estate that's full of Microsoft virtual machines, you can lift and shift and have business as usual today using OpenShift virtualization. And that was a very quick introduction to the concept of the Migration Toolkit for virtualization on OpenShift.